Welcome to the next Friday afternoon session of This Is My Life. Uh, in thinking about what I was going to do, I did a review in my mind of all the territory I've crossed up until now. And I really talked about what was significant in my life through the 1970s and early 1980s. My personal life, my life as dean at the California School of Professional Psychology, and my work with some clients who were particularly memorable to me as I searched for what my style as a therapist was to become. So let me move forward now in time, and I am going to enter things that began to unfold in the 1980s and onward. And the biggest chunk of that will probably take up all my time today. I want to talk about my interesting, ambivalent, and hurtful relationship with the American Psychological Association. Uh, I came to adulthood in the profession at a time where we were struggling, those of us who were applied psychologists, to create the profession. And one of the things we had to do was to recognize that our national association had very little interest in us. Our national association had traditionally been an association of research and academic psychologists, and our national association was not interested in or knew terribly much about people who were professional psychologists, who worked in clinics and hospitals and independent practices and actually tried to solve human problems directly. Uh, we were not in any positions of power in the association. So earlier, the process of trying to get those of us who were committed to the kinds of things we were struggling with appointed and elected to positions in the association started. And by the time of the 1980s, where I'm going to take up my talk, great progress had been made. Uh, the association was becoming more responsive to us. Since professional schools were growing everywhere in the country, the number of them was going up, and they were putting out doctoral level psychologists at a much higher rate than were the academic programs in psychology. I think the powers that be in the APA recognized that the membership was gradually changing. I remember sitting at a meeting in 1980s, and the executive officer put up a graph of the growth of the membership of the American Psychological Association, and it was fairly stagnant from 1944, where it came into existence in its present form, and 1972 or 1973 there was gradual increase from about 1,200 members to about 45 to 5,000 members. And then in the next few years, an exponential curve started to rise, and it was going up so rapidly now. So many psychologists were coming into the world, and so many psychologists were joining the American Psychological Association that we were laughing and saying by the year 2010, every citizen of the United States would be a member of the American Psychological Association if this phenomenon continues to reproduce itself in the fashion that it was already rising now. Clearly, that was not fated to happen. But I got my first posting to participate, real participation in the American Psychological Association that same year, where we began to screw around in the California Psychological Association with the possibility of creating a professional school. I was seated on the board, and my official title was representative to APA Council from the California Psychological Association. Each of the state associations had the right to elect one member to the legislative body of the National Association. And I had run successfully for that post in 1979 and had been elected. So it's a 3-year term, and one is eligible to get reelected for a second 3-year term. And then there are term limits. You can't run after that. But I was looking forward to sticking around for 6 years if I possibly could. And I soon learned a lot about organizational life and about organizational politics. The first year I showed up, the tensions between the practitioners and the research academic psychologists were very lively and very raw because the balance between the two of them was they were still in charge, but we were gradually chipping away and seizing power positions in the association a little at a time each year. And they were frightened because they could see the handwriting on the wall that they were going to lose control of the organization one day. Demographics would simply ensure that that was going to happen. So when I showed up the first year, the real excitement that I was experiencing was that the New York State Psychological Association had come up with 6 resolutions. They were called the NISPA resolutions because NYSPA was the initials of the New York State Psychological Association. And they were all matters that would have advanced the cause of those of us who were professional psychologists. I don't remember all 6. One of them was we should begin to try and get the insurance companies to reimburse the services of psychologists if there was to be a real future for that branch of the psychological community. We should keep supporting the state associations in their thrusting for licensure in all 50 states. Uh, I don't remember the other 4. Oh, yes, boards and committees of the association should reflect the oncoming composition, and more posts on the significant boards and committees of the governance of the association should be given over to people who are in practice or working in agencies. The applied wing should be given seats on those bodies. We wanted an affirmative action program. And we were taking on the women's cause too. We wanted more women in the governance of the American Psychological Association. Good, that's 4 of them. I don't remember the other 2. So those of us who were coming from the state associations were, of course, caballing with each other in advance of the legislative body's meeting and trying to figure out what our floor strategies were to get the resolution passed that would put the full weight and authority and some budgetary requests behind the 6 NISPA resolutions. And we introduced the bill, and then I had to learn about parliamentary procedure. Parliamentary maneuvering started, brought by the people who were very familiar with how the body runs. And the first thing they wanted to do was to sever the package, that we were not going to vote on them as a package. We would take them up on their merits one at a time, which we proceeded to do. And after we finish the first one, that the association should be vigorous in its advocacy for psychological services to be included in healthcare resolutions and healthcare plans. We ran into what the existing rules of the body was. Now, they were designed to make as little happen as possible, the rules of the body. If new business was introduced in the hopper, as we had, this was a new business item. It wasn't in the big agenda book that other people had cooked up in advance. New business items cannot be acted on in the at the meeting in which they're introduced. Not going to stampede anything here. New business items, it takes a 2/3 vote to set aside the rules so a vote can be taken on them at the meeting where they're introduced. There has to be some crisis or emergency that demands this. Otherwise, the new business item is referred to the board or committee of the association who does thinking about that, who's a think tank for this kind of thing. And it will come back a year later or maybe 2 years later if the people in the think tank are finally arrived at some consensus about whether they want to recommend an up or a down vote on it and the rationale for what their recommendation to the body is going to be. So the quickest we could get that heard would be in a year. And that's what happens. We didn't have the 2/3 vote. We took a roll call. We demanded that people say aye or nay to the roll call and whether there was a 2/3 vote to deal with it at that meeting. I began to understand the power, complexity, and maneuvering room given by parliamentary procedure and rules of conduct that organizations adopt. Well, we used up almost a full day just struggling with these 6 resolutions, all of which got referred out. So none of them were going to come back at least for a year. Boy, were we crestfallen. Jesus Christ, we thought these were so important. How could they waste that much time nattering about it? And we knew that the composition of the boards and committees, it's like Congress has its committees too. And Congress people sit on the committees, and sometimes there are staff members who have expertise about it. So it was going out to something like a congressional committee. And God knows when it would ever get taken up or whether it would get voted on in whatever way. And I remember going into the men's room during a break, and I was in a stall. The urinals were taken up, so I had to go into a stall to relieve myself and close the door. And I heard 2 guys gossiping at the urinals just outside. What do you think of Kovacs? Who the hell is he? Some fucking young Turk shows up and he wants to take over the association. God damn it. Are we going to have many of these people we're going to have to deal with in this organization? What can we do to shut him up? And the other guy said, well, I think we did a pretty effective job of shutting him up. He didn't get anywhere with any of that. And my ears were burning and I was in an impotent fury. And that was not good for my health. So I continued. I came back for the rest of my 3-year term. Uh, I, I, uh, I learned to nag. I saw where the resolutions had gone to which boards and committees, and I started writing letters. There were no emails back then. I started writing letters to the board and committee members or sending them faxes because fax machines were coming together finally. They were being introduced into the culture. And I would tell them I expected them to return the resolutions at the next year's meeting of the Council of Representatives. And they owed that to our constituency, and they could have the courage to recommend an upvote or a downvote. We could debate it on the floor after the recommendation, but would they please not act in an obstructionist fashion and return the resolutions to the members who wanted to vote, wanted to take votes on these matters. I hated that structure. So I proceeded from there. I wound up seated in the legislative body for 34 consecutive years. And I know there's a 6-year term limit, but I learned how to play the game. It's not only the states that get representatives, but the American Psychological Association is made up of substantive interest divisions. The first division, division number 1, is the division of general psychology. These were the old guys who had been around forever, and they thought there was such a thing as general psychology. We should all pull together and learn about what's happening everywhere in psychology. We should be Renaissance scholars. So they were in the division of general psychology, and it went on and on. The closest thing to our interests when we started was Division 12, the Division of Clinical Psychology. And most of us who were interested in applied psychology had joined that division. But just like the master organization, it too was in the grip of the conservatives. It was the people in the governance structure of Division 12 were professors at the major universities. And that soon began to be a toxic environment. We couldn't get anything done in the annual meetings of the divisions any more than we could get anything done in the annual meetings of the National Association. So we looked at the bylaws. It took 800 people to form a new division of the American Psychological Association, and it had to be approved by the Council of Representatives. So we decided to form the Division of Psychotherapy. Uh, that would pull a lot of the members of Division 12 out of Division 12 because that would be a more interesting interest group than the fuddy-duddy research paradigms that were being talked about in Division 12. At least we would all share a common interest in being interested in the future development of the Division of Psychotherapy. And the divisions were also ways to get seated in the parliament. Every division had, well, there were 100 votes in the parliament. The division, the 50 states took up one vote each, and the other 50 were apportioned according to what percentage of the membership was in those particular divisions. There were very small divisions that weren't more than the 800, and there were fairly large divisions. When we formed the division of psychotherapy, it got 15,000 members to join it. So it had 4 council representatives. So I started to cycle around, and I would get elected from California, then I would get elected from the division of psychotherapy. Then we soon spun off another division because the division of psychotherapy started to get too conservative for us, and we founded a division of independent practice in the early 1980s, and I became president of that division. Then I became a council representative from 2 terms from that division, and I wound up the last one that I played that game with was we got pissed off finally at the division of women in psychology. The women were following behind the practitioners, and there were women practitioners, of course, and they saw that to get power in the association, you had to play these strange games. So they decided they would build a political base in the association by founding the division of women in psychology, which they proceeded to do, and they got a huge membership because it didn't mind women didn't mind what their careers were about. They wanted to be a member of the division to give the division political clout because every kind, the research scientists women, the practitioner women, the women who were interested in social justice, the women who were interested in education, whatever was their career path, they certainly agreed that women needed to be better represented in the association. So they poured into Division 35, it was in large numbers. I got sick of this whole thing. I tried to help them as much as possible. I had become smart about bylaws. I helped them write their bylaws. I would coach their representatives on how to manipulate the parliamentary procedure in the chamber. And I was really very friendly with them. They invited me to come to their meetings to be a consultant on the running of their own board meetings. So I had good relationships with them. And I said, you know what? We men are following behind you. We're about 10 years behind. We're only now beginning to see what oppression the culture inflicts on men. We die 7 years younger than you do. We're stolid and taciturn, and we have a whole variety of personality traits that are much admired in men. And being men as traditionally men are defined is very toxic. We're starting to write scientific articles about this. We're starting to take this up in therapy sessions with men. There's a whole men's movement starting now. For Christ's sake, could we just change the name of the division of women in psychology to the division for the study of gender roles? And it could be a non-sex oriented division. It would be a home for both men and women who are seriously interested in seeing how culture deforms and hurts us depending on what our gender is. So they said they would take it up at their meeting, and they had a vigorous debate about whether they were interested in pursuing this. And they said they voted finally no. They were interested in some kind of collaboration. So if those of us who were active in the men's movement wanted to have a committee in the division of women, a committee devoted to men's studies, we could have a committee in their division. And I told them to go fuck themselves, and we founded a competing division. I still hope those 2 damn divisions will get together one day and merge into something sensible and not look at each other with the same distrust and lack of affinity that they should be showing. So that's a disappointment to me. But I did get elected to council. I got benefit out of that. I got elected to council from 2 terms from division 40. No, it's 46. That's what it is, that division. In addition to serving on council, I was doing other things. The the founding president of CSPP wanted us to be very visible those of us who were in the senior administration of the school, wanted us to be visible in the American Psychological Association. He thought that was another way this new, untested professional school would get panache and stature, because important people who are in positions of significance are attached to this institution. And it just isn't some flaky, crazy people. He himself put together a cabal. The aim was to get him elected as the first practitioner president of the American Psychological Association, which he did succeed in doing in the early 1980s. Nick Cummings became the first practitioner ever to occupy that seat. We succeeded in putting the coalitions together that would get him elected. So I was reaching out to do other things. Many of them I was curious about, as because I had run and was still teaching in a professional school even after my deanship. I wanted to get on the committee on accreditation because I wanted to understand how it functioned, how it developed its guidelines, what its philosophy was, and why I thought some of its guidelines were so strange. And all those terms on boards and commissions are for 3 years, and the board of directors of APA appoints its members. So I persuaded the board of directors to let me serve a term on the committee on accreditation. There was another movement that had started. Oh, this one's really interesting. A federal judge in DC had dealt with a complaint made by a man who wanted to sit for the license exam. He had no degree in psychology, and he wanted to sit for the license exam anyhow because he had studied what he believed was a useful curriculum in psychology, and he was turned down. And he took that to federal court because, of course, there's nothing but federal court in D.C. because D.C. is a federal territory. And the federal judge issued a ruling on his behalf that the licensing board had to allow him to sit for the licensing exam. And what was their rationale? They said uh, psychology is an inchoate discipline. There's no agreed upon curriculum, and there's no particular set of things that psychologists are committed to learning or doing. Therefore, anybody who wants to be a psychologist should be able to sit for the licensing exam. Educational or curricular restrictions are unconstitutional for such people. Oh, did that cause consternation? And we are stuck with the law of unintended consequences because the Committee on Accreditation was now charged with drawing up a core curriculum in various fields of psychology. And those of us who wanted to be applied psychologists working with human suffering, they drew up all the areas that we had to study in the curriculum of our graduate schools, and we had to get the degree to justify from such an institution that taught that, to justify why we were psychologists. And the licensing boards it was recommended to the licensing boards that they adopt these standards that have been developed by the American Psychological Association as the correct standards, defining the training and the degree that a psychologist would occupy in order to be for a license. It only took about 4 years for all those pieces to fall in place. And my own institution that I had founded, the California School of Professional Psychology, started to have to make wrenching adjustments in its curriculum to fall into line with the modal curriculum. And it became such a break on any innovation, or such a break on thinking in a variety of different ways than we were used to thinking. I'm very unhappy with this. There must have been another solution, even though I couldn't think of any at the time. A second thing was moving with great rapidity. The profession was becoming medicalized, and more and more people thought that the future of the profession lie in making close alliances with medical settings and, wonder, getting prescribing privileges for ourselves. We shouldn't cede that over to psychiatrists any more than we should have ceded to them the right to be the only player in town to get insurance reimbursements. It was time to train psychologists to be ready for prescribing privileges and then move the state legislatures one at a time to expand the scope of practice of psychologists with that training to allow them to prescribe medication. I was vehemently opposed to that. Oh my God, did I struggle with that one. Uh, I thought that that was a cry to our extinction. I would make passionate speeches both in the halls of some of the divisions I belonged to and in the national legislature. I would point out certain facts that weren't being attended to. One was the profession of psychiatry was dying. Fewer and fewer people were signing up for psychiatric residencies. In the year I last made that speech, in the year 1992, the statistic was terrible. Only 38% of all residencies in psychiatry in the United States were filled by Americans. It was foreign people coming from other countries to study American psychiatry. It wasn't, I think some of them wanted to stay after they came here, but it, excuse me, I'm parched. I'm going to drink something. It wasn't American doctors who wanted to become psychiatrists. Now, I didn't blame them. Psychiatry has always been the lowest status specialty in medicine. When I was young, psychiatry was devoted to mainly to psychoanalysis and the talking cure. And at any annual AMA meeting, the psychiatrists would catch shit about why are they wasting their medical education and what kind of doctors are they if they sit in a room and talk to somebody. They never do a physical examination. There's no physical procedure they're engaged in. Only a small number of biological psychiatrists who are doing insulin or experimental lobotomies. They were real doctors. They were doing the body and sit back. The third reason why we had some systems problems here. So I, at the risk of repeating myself, become junior psychiatrist, as I presented with some passion, was that all the financial incentives for doing that kind of work of prescribing are tilted towards prescribing and not talking. Only 20% in the year I made this last address, only 20% of psychiatrists were spending any time any longer billing for anything called psychotherapy. They could see people from medical management, it's called, in 15-minute increments, and they can see four such people in 15 minutes, and they can bill three times as much for that as they can for a single session of psychotherapy. Now, what idiot would want to spend time doing psychotherapy if they can make three times as much pushing pills? We are as venal as anybody else and as easily corrupted as anybody else. We're not more noble. My colleagues kept saying to me that we were more noble. We wouldn't do that. We're well trained as psychotherapists, and we would only occasionally use medication, and we would try and help people get off medication. And I said, yes, we'll start that way, but the economic incentives will be overwhelming, and we will be as corrupted as anybody else is eventually. That's the slippery road to perdition, as far as I'm concerned. The fifth reason is it's also a terrible way to define who we are. We have to buy into the statistical, diagnostic, and statistical manual of the American Psychiatric Association of what it is we're attempting to work with. And everybody has to have a mental disorder, and we're working with the impaired, trying to fix the impaired, which suggests, as the insurance companies will stick us with, that we have to do short short-term work. We can't spend too much time. Just improve the functions of the impaired a little bit, make some gains, and then close up your work. And we're going to do what's called symptom treatment, rather than helping people to reorganize their lives when they need to reorganize their lives. Also, throwing away a good deal of the population who would like to come see us and need some counsel and some advice, not because they're damaged, but because they're lost in something that they don't understand and need some wise elder to help them with it. Why give up that market and say we deal with people with nervous and mental disorders? We're junior psychiatrists. Yes, we have a good argument to make. We can probably win that battle because the geographic distribution of psychologists is much better than psychiatrists. There are hardly any psychiatrists in rural places. They like living in cities. And there will be much better, quote, mental health coverage, close quotes, in the rural areas if psychologists are given prescribing privileges. That's not a good reason to do it. So that was a battle I was fighting. Uh, and I still feel passionately about it. So let's see, what else did I do? Oh, the dire prediction of the psychiatrist came to be true. The the main number of persons in the American Psychological Association were not research academic psychologists. There were a variety of other kinds of critters. We had there was now a board of educational affairs, a board of professional affairs, a board of public affairs. There were a bunch of psychologists wanting to apply psychology to do good in the culture, and there was a board of scientific affairs. We were divided between four interest groups. The biggest one of which was the board of practice, the board of professional affairs. They represented the biggest constituency. So the research academic scientists started to get restless. They started to threaten that they were going to leave APA. They didn't want to have to sit in meetings, particularly governance meetings, and listen to a lot of debates about a lot of things that they had no interest in and couldn't care less about. They didn't want to have to pay dues that were funding activities they had no interest in, or were even antithetical to. And unless some solution to this problem was found, they were seriously going to consider picking up and leaving. And they sounded serious. Now, a lot of my colleagues said, great, let him go. We'll just take over completely. I didn't feel that way. I was somehow devoted to the proposition that all psychologists should stick together if possible. So, consulting with some of my other friends in the council, we came up with a proposal. We would now create something called the Practice Directorate in APA. Most of the things that concern practice, like protesting, bringing suits against managed care companies for not providing proper psychological services, bringing antitrust actions against some managed care entities for having what was called shadow panels, for listing a large number of psychologists who were no longer signed up with them, who had quit and discussed, but saying to their members that these people were all available until they tried to call them. Shadow panels was a very, very big thing in the managed care world. They claimed to have many more providers than they actually did. And lobbying, giving money to the state associations, making grants to the state associations to lobby for legislation, starting a lobbying effort of our own in the federal Congress. The academic psychologists did do a little bit, tiny bit of lobbying, but we had massive lobbying we wanted to do for mental health programs of various kinds, and it would take a staff and it would take money. So we proposed to set up a practice directorate with staff members who would carry out these functions, and with the board of professional affairs directing them, telling them what were the projects we wanted them to engage in. And that whole enterprise would be funded by a special tax just on licensed psychologists. Every licensed psychologist would pay not only general APA dues, but would have to pay $80 dues on top of that. So it was only people who would benefit from the activities of this unique thing that we're creating that would have to pay special funds to make it possible. And licensed psychologists who worked in academic institutions would be exempt from that $80 payment. It would only be people whose careers were based on them being professional psychologists, other than teaching careers, careers of service, they would be taxed. So that worked for a while. It ran, and we began to run in trouble. What we were doing was illegal from a tax perspective, and it did not stop the erosion of the institution and more non-research academic psychologists taking up positions of influence in various things that the research academic psychologists were concerned about, but now they were being outvoted on boards and committees and in the general legislature. They didn't like the drift of what was happening. And now they were saying in for sure that they needed to leave. So I came up with another idea. They were proposing, and I was willing to view this on its merits. They were proposing that APA devolve into four separate organizations. And the four boards that existed: a research academic organization, a public interest organization, an organization for psychologists in education, and an organization for psychologists in applied careers. They would be semi-autonomous. They would have their own due structure. They would hold their own conventions. They would publish their own journals. There were only a few things they would do in common. The ethical standards of psychologists would be approved by an overarching board that would be responsible for reviewing and updating the ethics code periodically. They would continue to approve accreditation standards because that was the intersection between research academic psychologists and applied psychologists. The ethical the work of the accreditation committee had impact on both of them, and there was a list of other things, a few other things. There were about 4 or 5 items at some overarching board that all four groups would send representation to would happen. APA at that point had a huge, wonderful headquarters building in downtown Washington, near the Union Station, right next to the new Trump Hotel. As a matter of fact, it was in prime real estate land that was being redeveloped, and had many tenants, including the National Association of School of Social Workers, and it was generating really lovely income for the association. So the four groups would be the general would share a quarter share of the ownership of that property. So each of them would benefit from it. And whatever money was in the reserve fund would also be divided up between the four groups. And that was the basis on which we should start negotiating. If we did that, then they would not leave. So I got appointed to a task force that was to start negotiation meetings and how we could move from the structure we had now to this kind of semi-autonomous structure. We had lawyers advising us too, and we halted the flight out in that period of time. What it took, however, was massive overhaul of the existing bylaws of the American Psychological Association to move from and the articles of incorporation to move from the structure it had to the new structure. And we had many wranglings about the wording in that. Finally, after 4 days of 8 hours of arguing, we came to a final resolution that we were going to propose to the council the following changes in board of bylaws, and it would be ratified. And then if it was ratified by a 2/3 vote of the council, then it would be sent out to the members, because the members have to vote by 2/3 to make changes in the association's bylaws. And we would provide pro statements for why all of us representing various kinds of psychologists thought that this was a workable solution and a good idea. And I was charged with writing the documents and coming up with graphs. I was the first one to had a computer at that point. I had the capabilities of doing things on a computer that nobody else at the meeting had. So the meeting came up on the agenda, and all my colleagues urged a no vote of the council. They were still pursuing the let them go fuck themselves agenda. And they were going to have it die in the House of Representatives. And after much backroom yelling and arguing, we told them that wasn't a good thing to do. If you want to lobby the members to defeat it, don't have it defeated here, because for sure you're going to provoke a walkout by the research academic psychologists, and then what's going to happen to us? God only knows. Uh, but I think they might listen differently if they can't sell the membership on it. Then I think the impetus to be angry and to rebel would be somewhat lessened. And you guys are capable of money, a mailing campaign to the membership or having meetings about it. Please don't do it here. So I got them to wait a while. And then a series of regional meetings were scheduled where the pros and cons of doing this would be held in various cities across the United States. And Stanley Graham, my friend, was one of the people of three of us who represented the practitioners as we did the original negotiations. Rogers Wright, my old friend and enemy, corrupt bastard that he was the third practitioner. And he left the meetings early. He was so angry we were making progress. He wanted the damn thing to die at the planning stage, let alone successfully succeed to the next stage of being talked about. So he had walked out, but Stanley and I had made a pledge to the other members that we were working with. All of us would go back to our respective constituencies and advocate for the passage of this, for this reformation and transformation of the National Association. So Stanley and I showed up at the first one that had, council did agree to vote to send it on to the membership, provided that these meetings where members could come and educate themselves would be held, would take place. So the first meeting happened a few weeks after the council meeting. It was a meeting for the presidents of the state psychological associations. They were being brought to Washington every year by the practice directorate, and they would have a workshop on what's happening legislatively and in the economy and in the culture that's going to affect psychology. And each one had a visit on the Hill with both their respective congressman and their respective senator to talk about what they were briefed to talk about and why these things were important to psychology and to the constituency of the congressman. It was a very, very nice activity, and people look forward to coming. So one of the things on their agenda was the debate over the transformation of the association. And Rogers Wright and one other person were going to speak against it because these were all practitioners in that room. And Stanley Graham and I were to speak in favor of it, as we had pledged to do to the people we had worked with. The night before I was supposed to make my speech, I had just arrived in Washington that day. I wasn't part of the president's convocation, but I came as a speaker. I was being paid to come there by APA. One of the I got a phone call in the middle of the night from Rogers Wright. He said, "Would you and Stanley Graham come to a meeting? We have to have a meeting before the presentations tomorrow." So of course we got up in the middle of the night. I took my jammies off and threw some clothes on. Sleepy-eyed Stanley Graham, my friend and colleague, showed up in the hall, and we go into Rogers Wright room, and there were a bunch of people there. There was Rogers Wright. There was who is he from North Carolina? I'm having a senior moment. My Ron Fox, my good friend Ron Fox is one of the decent people, the most decent people I ever heard was there. Plus some other practitioners who were presidents of other state associations were there. There were about 7 people in the room and the two of us. And Roger said, we're taking this very seriously. We have put together a campaign committee, a letter writing campaign, a phone call committee. We're going to hit the pavements to defeat this sucker. And I want you to know that's a very powerful coalition we have, and lots of people are volunteering help. And if either one of you is willing to change your position and say that it was a mistake for you to be advocating for this. You've noticed that the scientists are acting in bad faith. They have a secret plan to seize the assets of the American Psychological Association. They're going to bring a lawsuit against this if it passes and freeze the assets and try and walk away with more of the assets of the association than are predicted to be given and distributed. Just say that they bargained with you in bad faith to set you up. You've discovered the plot and you're now changing sides. You want this defeated. And if either one of you will take this offer, we will ensure that you get elected next year as the president of the American Psychological Association. We can deliver the presidency to you. And you guys may want to go out in the hall and discuss this. Do you both want to do it? In which case, we'll pick one of you. Is one of you willing to do it? Is none of you willing to do it? In which case, we'll crush you if you want to run for anything ever again in this association. So I went out in the hall and I said, Stanley, you have a different conscience than I do. Yours is very malleable. And I said, you've been thinking of running for president. You've wanted to. You've thought of running next year anyhow. And here, this will guarantee that you get elected. I can't, in good faith, do that. I am screwed. When I give my word, I take it seriously. I'm not going to back down. I'm going to make the speech I'm prepared to make. Why I believe that this is a good solution for all of psychology, and why we should not fractionate into 4 groups. Uh, Desirable as this might be for the research scientists. Now, I'm not going to lie that this was a cabal, and I know for sure that they entered into that one. They entered into the agreement in bad faith. So we went back in the room, and Ron Fox said, I don't want to participate in this. This is corrupt, and I'm leaving. And he left. He wouldn't stick around while the rest of it got negotiated out. And Stanley said, I'm game. And I said, I'm not going to do it. And I left. And the next day, Stanley Rogers made the first speech. Stanley was introduced as the second speaker. I was going to be the final speaker. He took his speech out and he tore it up. And he says, this really grieves me. It hurts me to do this. But when I arrived here, I had some conversations with some of the people who had planned what's being sent to the membership. And he made the speech. I found out that there's corruption involved. There's a plan afoot. Lawyers have been hired that as soon as the new bylaws are ratified, the funds are going to be tied up in court. A case is going to be made about why the division should not be the way it is, and we're going to get screwed. And I can't, in good conscience, put up with the duplicity of the research academic coalition. We know that they've been out to crush us ever since we came into being, and this is just their latest maneuver and still attempting to crush us and to prevent us from coming into what's rightfully ours. And Rogers, of course, had said, we are going to win this without reorganizing anything. Let them go. There's no good reason to not to let them go. They provide nothing for us. And let them go, to use the Russian phrase, let them go and choke on their own vomit, he said. And I made my speech after I'd forgotten who the stand-in was for the other person who wasn't there. Was one of the presidents. Made my speech, and I said, I am going to go out to the meetings in the state if I have to go at my own expense, and I am going to lobby for the passage of the bylaws that are being sent to the membership. And that year, both Stanley Graham and I got ourselves nominated to be president, to run for president of the American Psychological Association. It is very simple to get nominated. It takes about 20 nomination votes from if 20 members nominate you, you're likely to be nominated to be president of the American Psychological Association. Such lack of interest in the election is there. And so we got on the ballot, plus three other people. There are always five candidates, and the Hare system is used. A vote is taken of membership. Only about 20% ever votes. A vote is taken, and you rank order the candidates. You put your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, fourth choice, and fifth choice. Then they count all the first choices. If you have the fewest of your first choices, then your ballots are not tossed, but your second choice is looked at, and that's added to all the first place ballots. If your voters gave 100 of second place votes to candidate B, your candidate A, 100 of your ballots are put on candidate B's thing. Then the count is done again. Who has the most ballots and who has the least? And the least votes is eliminated again, and the votes are redistributed. Then the next to last, and the votes are redistributed until there's one last candidate who's now the recipient of everybody else's cast off votes, and that person becomes president of the American Psychological Association. So much to my surprise, I got a mailing in the mail. Stanley Graham had taken the mailing list of all the divisions that I had belonged to. He'd gotten the mailing list somehow, and he told a lie in his mailings. He told a lie that he and I were the two strong practitioner candidates, and we had a brotherhood going, and that everybody should vote for either one of us in whatever way they wanted for first place, but our second place votes should be given to the other candidate. And under no circumstances should they be given to any of the other three candidates. We were running together. We were brothers in arms, taking up the arms of getting another practitioner elected to the presidency of the American Psychological Association. Stanley Graham was elected president of the American Psychological Association. His mailing campaign and all the on-ground messages being left by the people who had volunteered to push the election. And this was the first time in the American Psychological Association's history where there was any kind of real electioneering done for anybody. The presidency had always been an honorary sort of thing that was given for great honor in the association and never for a political purpose. The association was politicized in some of the same way our nation is currently politicized, with dirty tricks, lies, backroom deals, corruption, and everything else. It was absolutely disgusting to me. Did I stop talking to Stanley Graham? No. I congratulated him. Like him, I had a certain degree of thinking about his utility. He was going to be president. He had power as president to do certain things. I was not going to stop talking to him. I was going to treat him like the Russians treat Trump. I would use him as a useful idiot and see if I could play him to get some things done that were important. And he reciprocated by appointing me as the parliamentarian of the association, which meant that I sat up on the dais with him at the Council of Representatives meeting, and I kept whispering in his ear what he should do, how he should treat motions, which ones he should declare out of order, what parliamentary procedure he should follow in dealing with the things that would be placed in the hopper and on the agenda of the meeting to help him work his way through the meeting in an effective fashion. Oh, God. So that was, I'll go on to the last thing, which was all this time, by the way. I was flying to meetings. I was going about every 6 weeks for long weekends somewhere to a board, a committee, a governing body of one of the divisions, the Council of Representatives itself. I was using an inordinate amount of my time and talents. And I was harming my family. I was gone frequently for sentimental events. I missed birthdays sometimes. I missed Valentine's Day. And I asked for forbearance from my brood. I was convinced what I was doing was terribly important. Both my narcissism was wrapped up in it, and my sense of public abuse was wrapped up into it. I was doing things both for my discipline and the public that would make the fit between them better and bring better services to a larger number of people. And that was more important than my personal comfort or my family sense of well-being to me. And my wife would plead with me sometimes and get angry with me sometimes, and I would stick to my guns. Uh, The other thing I had to actually bear witness to was a cynical comment Hermine once meant to me. She said, "What you're joining is a great travel club. Most of the people you're with like to go to these meetings because they're having love affairs. They're leaving their spouses behind and they're hooking up with somebody they met in the course of their participating in governance." And absolutely, I knew that that was correct. There lots of gossip about who's sleeping with whom every time I would go to a meeting. Uh, but there was one more project. I persuaded three of the divisions of the American Psychological Association. Uh, the division of psychoanalysis we now had, the division of psychotherapy, and the division of independent practice. We were the ones who were being hurt the most by managed care. It was clamping down on how many visits we could give. It was giving us enormous version of amounts of documentation we had to give. It was stingy with visits. We had to justify even the first visit sometimes and get pre-authorization. It was suffocating us. And the practice director was doing the best it could to bring lawsuits of one sort or another, but it didn't have a sufficient long range strategy about how to deal with the problem. So we decided we would set up an interdivisional task force on managed care, and we would do some brainstorming. We would meet 2 or 3 times a year. We would get the divisions to come up with some of their dues money to belong in the divisions to fund the meeting of the thing. We would do it as cheaply as possible. We would figure in what city was the closest to where we all lived. It would cost the least in airfares. That's where we go. And if it was even better if somebody lived there and we could sleep on their floors in sleeping bags or something, so we didn't have to pay for hotel reservations. We were really trying to do the brainstorming on a cheap. And after some brainstorming, we came to the conclusion about a year in that there was no willingness in the society and no lobbying capability that the American Psychological Association had that could bring any legislative change to what was going on. The only solution lay in designing a better healthcare system in general that didn't need managed care and was run in an entirely different way. And second of all, even with managed care, the premiums the worker the employers were making to fund the care of workers kept going up. Managed care had been promised to them that it was going to contain their premium costs, but it wasn't working. Premiums were going up at a higher rate than were the inflation rate in the country. So we had a slogan. We were going to break the employers of the nation away from their allegiance and alliances with the healthcare companies. They were not the friend of the corporations any more than they were the friend of the providers. We were going to design a, a company friendly healthcare system that would provide better care and would not have to be managed in any way. It would be self. So how the hell do you do that? So the second year of our existence, we started studying what goes on in other nations, single payer plans of various kinds. Uh, uh, the Swiss have a competing plan. There's a public plan and a private plan available to the citizens of the country. There are various models we studied, and eventually we like the Australian plan. Uh, the government had a universal health care plan for everybody, and it set up a fee reimbursement rate for the people who were the providers in the plan. Hospitals could charge X amount, and get reimbursed by the government for the following days in the hospital, procedures that they did, and each individual practitioners would state what the procedures were they did as part of their practice, and there would be a government rate for doing that. However, the providers would love this too. And that there would the bosses didn't have to buy any insurance anymore. All this was provided by the government. But the private part of it was everybody could be partially private also. The hospitals could say, if you want to come here, we're going to charge 110 or 120% of what the government is giving us. We can't survive on that. Our overhead's too great. We need to add an extra on that you're responsible for. And now private insurance companies, just like they do for the elderly, can sell co-insurance if the people who are using the private insurance want to get reimbursed for it and have some insurance company get it. They will pay for that premium out of pocket for themselves, or they'll pay the copays out of pocket for themselves. And there would be a board that would say what's covered and adjust the fees one way or another. Adjust the upper limit on what the copays could be asked, adjust what the regular thing was that was going to be given to people. The two systems would be in competition. Every once in a while, they would up the public system so more people would flow into the public system and drop having access to the private system. It was a very dynamic system. And we thought it was quite feasible and would work. And the employers would love it because they wouldn't be asked to contribute anything towards healthcare anymore. And the citizens could learn to pay attention to what the real costs were. And the providers would love it because nobody was managing them anymore. They could go on for as long as they wanted to, and they would report only to their people who were hiring them, namely the patients who would decide whether they were getting benefit and wanted to fire them or not, or wanted to move on to somebody else instead. It was a very dynamic and open system with great freedom of choice, and that's what we were going to recommend. And we would start trying to, there were several people coming together. The nurses, the Kaiser Foundation, a bunch of nonprofits were coming together to join into healthcare planning for the future. And we were going to try and get admitted to that group so we could advance the benefits of the Australian system. Well, I got my heart broken. I was already getting burned out enough from all the work I had been doing over all the years. But I came back, we reported to the three divisions, the Division of Psychotherapy. They got restless about continuing to fund us. What are you guys doing? You're chasing pie in the sky. We're paying you to have nice vacations 3 or 4 times a year. And what the hell are we getting? You're idealistic. Why would psychologists want to say anything about what the national healthcare system should look like? We don't have any expertise. You guys are, what are you smoking? They would say to us. So we brought back the plan and tried to advocate to them to those three divisions. They refused to recommend them to the American Psychological Association. Clearly, if we were going to enter any consortium of nonprofits in the country trying to move by consensus towards some kind of replacement national health care plan, this would have to be endorsed by the American Psychological Association as a formal endorsement of a plan to be put forward by our national association. So as individual council representatives, we put it in the hopper, and it went through the hopper, and we got the same goddamn thing. The American Psychological Association refused to participate. They didn't want to endorse this. They got themselves invited as observers to these national meetings that were being held by the nonprofits. They could go observe the dialogue that was going on. We could have been seated at the table participating in negotiations with other people, even with consumer groups were there at that at those meetings. We threw it away because who are we? Who are we? We have nothing to say about national health. That just broke my heart. I would still try at meetings to bring it up again. I would say, look, you're complaining and grumbling about this. We came up with a solution. Would you like to hear about it again and why it's a sensible solution and why we psychologists can take some leadership position? We know a lot about how the healthcare system works. We know a lot about how the mental health care system fails to work. We know a lot about patient compliance. There are health psychologists now who know a lot about patient interfacing with physicians and other parts of the healthcare system and what they listen to and what they don't listen to. We have tremendous expertise. Why can't we advance this? And I would see eyes rolling and people muttering to each other, ah, there he goes and again. It was like I was the mad King Lear who was coming into meeting and bringing the same crap over and over again. And they wanted to talk about who should get awards this year, which members of the division were to be recognized and given a plaque. That was more important than dealing with the nation's healthcare system. So I gave up. I signed out. I dropped out of all my governance positions in the American Psychological Association. And I told my wife I was coming home. And my children and my wife were overjoyed. And I've stayed home ever since. And I've had more time for friends. I've had more time for symbolic and ritual events with my family. I Do I regret what I did? Yeah, in some ways I regret it. In other ways I don't regret it. I was a different person then. I've become something else now. And I feel sickened by the thought of what I did. The person I am now could no longer do those things anymore. Magical as they seemed, and what a sense of competency and potency they gave me while I was doing them, but no more. I don't need that. That really was a drug. And I have now forsworn the drug. I have no relationship to organizational life anymore. And on that note, I will stop today. The floor is open.
Arthur, what happened to the practice directorate?
The practice directorate was severed from its official position with the American Psychological Association by consultants we had who were expert on tax laws. The American Psychological Association is a corporation who, in its purposes, say that it is an educational and scientific corporation. An educational scientific corporation is constrained to not give more than 1% of its gross revenues in advocacy efforts. And it cannot advocate, it can advocate for bills in legislatures, but it cannot advocate for candidates for office. The practice director with the $80 was doing that. And they didn't like the tax on some parts of the association. So that was abolished. The practice director was spun off as a separate corporation, separately incorporated as a business and professions corporation, which can give up to 20% of its revenues for advocacy and can directly campaign for candidates. So it was free of those constraints. That part is good, but its income stream has been badly crippled. It is dependent now on contributions. At the time of the annual dues collection, APA members are asked if they would like to make a voluntary contribution to the name of that corporation. And it's working on a very small budget. So that makes me partly heartsick. And have overlapping board of directors. It's not to engage in anything that would bring dishonor to APA. So the APA board of directors changes hats and puts on a different baseball cap when it takes up. It's now seated as the board of directors of the practice corporation.
Going back to your run for president, it seems like there was a conspiracy to prevent you from becoming president. Yeah.
Well, Yes, there was.
You were robbed.
Oh, you know what? I was rescued. Stanley and I kept our friendships going. I told him I would hold him no bitterness, even though he stabbed me in the back. And I will not punish him for his venality in selling his soul for the mess of pottage of being able to be president of APA. He told me he was only commuting from New York, but he had to go to Washington frequently. When he looks at his practice income and what it cost him to stand in as president, he thinks it cost him $120,000 of his own money the year he was president of the American Psychological Association. And he had, academic institutions usually pay those kinds of expenses for any faculty member who has such an honor as to be elected to such a position. But he had to pay that out of his own pockets. And I thought, oh my God, I've been rescued. I would have to declare bankruptcy if that happened to me. So I was spared that. The gods were
Yeah.
kind to me and I didn't even know it, because I would have to be gone for even longer periods of time and even have to take airplanes and spend many more hours in the air.
Mm.
After all your years on the council, Arthur, what are your current views of APA?
The council has become the Soviet proletariat. What is the name of the Soviet Presidium? It is a figurehead thing. It has no more power. The board of directors of APA has very little power. The full-time executive staff is doing everything. They recommend things to the people who are the decision makers, and the decision makers don't want to put in the time and effort necessary to become very familiar with what the complexities are. They have wonderful dog and pony presentations, slides and videos to make to the Council of Representatives, who's entertained, and then rubber stamps almost everything it's asked to vote on. It's not an active debating a society anymore, or a society that wants to participate in decision making. I get heartsick when I think about that too, and I turn away from thinking about it. I'm glad I'm not there anymore. That's probably an uphill fight that could not be won. Oh, I think they changed the bylaw so that people could only serve for 3 years too. And they could not succeed themselves ever from anywhere else. So they now have a bunch of people coming who are naive, don't understand how the organization works, and is much more ready to have a dog and pony show presented to them, and then they're being asked to vote because they have the illusion that now they understand something that they didn't understand before. Any other questions or comments? Well, everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving,
You
and
too?
I will get back probably to my personal life and or some practice matters during the 80s and onward, because I've let that go while I was talking about organizational life today. Oh, good. I have no more organizational life to talk about ever. How wonderful.
Hard
Have
enough
a
to
good
live through it.
Thanksgiving.
You too. Okay.
Have a good Thanksgiving, guys.
All right. Be well, you guys.
See
Bye.
ya. Bye.